Hello, my name is Julie. I'm 66 years old, and I want to share a story that shook my world. One bitterly cold night, my own daughter pushed me out into the darkness, telling me to sleep with the dogs. I walked the empty streets, feeling invisible, abandoned, like my life had quietly ended. Every step echoed my despair, and I couldn't see how I could go on. Then, through the shadows, I saw a small boy, covered in dirt, standing there with eyes that seemed too wise for his age. He stopped, looked into my soul, and whispered, "Can you be my grandma just for tonight?" His words pierced the loneliness that had wrapped me for so long. In that fragile moment, I felt a flicker of something I thought I'd lost forever: hope. I had no idea then that one simple question would change everything. What happened after that night was unlike anything I could have imagined. Secrets, unexpected connections, and moments that tested every belief I had about love and family awaited me. And yet, nothing could have prepared me for the surprises that were still to come. But before we dive into the full story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading your messages and seeing how far this story reaches. Now, let's discover how this journey really began. After my husband's death, loneliness became my only companion. It wasn't just the emptiness of the house or the quiet meals I had to endure alone. It was the kind of loneliness that burrows deep into your chest, making every breath feel heavier than the last. I had spent all my savings on his treatment, selling our home's furniture, my jewelry, even the antique clock his father had left him. Every piece I parted with felt like cutting away a piece of my soul, but I told myself it was worth it. I told myself that keeping him alive, even for a few extra months, was all that mattered, and yet, when he finally passed, the silence was unbearable. The sound of nothing reverberated through the rooms, mocking the effort, the sacrifices. The love I had poured into keeping him with me, I was left with nothing: no home, no money, and an aching sense of purposelessness. I moved in with my daughter Emily and her husband, hoping to start over, to find some small corner of stability where I could breathe again. I thought I might help with household chores, perhaps babysit grandchildren she might one day have, and in return, I would have a place to sleep and a sense of belonging. I carried my few remaining belongings in an old backpack, worn at the seams, as though it reflected the state of my heart. I had imagined laughter, shared meals, and warm conversations. I had imagined a new chapter, a soft landing after the fall of so many hard years. Within the first week, reality shattered my fragile expectations. Emily came into the kitchen one morning, her expression neutral but her voice sharp. "Mom, you need to contribute." "I can't support another mouth," she said, placing her perfectly manicured hands on her hips. I felt my chest tighten, my throat constricting as I tried to explain. "Emily, I spent everything on your father. I sold nearly everything we owned. I have nothing left. Please, just give me some time to recover." My voice trembled, though I tried to steady it with the remnants of dignity I clung to so desperately. Her face hardened, her eyes devoid of warmth. "If you don't have money, then go sleep with the dogs. That's where useless people like you belong." The words cut deeper than any knife ever could. My own daughter, the little girl I had once rocked to sleep and nursed through fevers, the girl whose scraped knees I had kissed, and whose heartbreaks I had comforted, was telling me I was worthless. I stood there, clutching the straps of my backpack, unable to find words. My heart ached, but not just with sadness. It was outrage, disbelief, a fierce, burning injustice that made the world feel colder than it already was. I was thrown out that night. The door closed behind me with a sound like finality itself. The city was cold, the wind biting through the thin coat I had barely kept. The streets felt endless, empty, and indifferent. Every step I took on the frozen pavement made me question the meaning of loyalty, of love, of family. I wandered aimlessly, the city lights casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to mock my despair. Hours passed. I kept moving, half conscious of the numbness in my fingers, the sting in my cheeks. That's when I saw him. Across the street, sitting alone on a park bench, was a small boy, no older than 12, dirty, with his hair sticking to his tear-streaked face. Our eyes met, and in that brief instant, a silent understanding passed between us, to lost souls recognizing each other, each bearing wounds the other could sense but not yet name. He approached timidly, clutching something invisible in his small fists. His voice was trembling, almost breaking, but there was a desperate hope underlying it. Can you be my grandma just for tonight? I froze. My body shivered not from the cold, but from the weight of what he had asked. Something inside me broke, and yet, simultaneously, something else awoke. An instinct, a spark, a recognition that I was not truly alone, that my heart could still hold space for another being, even in the depths of despair. We walked together down a side alley, huddling close to shield each other from the wind. We didn't speak much at first. There was nothing to say that could fill the enormity of the night, the pain, or the fear. I offered him the small warmth of my coat, and he leaned against me, shivering. I felt the tremors in his body, mirrored in my own. For a moment, the world narrowed to the two of us, a fragile cocoon of shared suffering, silent understanding, and unspoken trust. I learned the curve of his back, the slouch of his shoulders carrying the weight of something far older than his years. I learned how he clutched at the hem of his sleeve when he thought no one was looking, how his lips quivered when he tried to hide his tears. I felt every ounce of fear and loneliness he carried, as though it was mine too. I whispered softly, almost to myself, "You're not invisible." Not tonight. Time passed in a strange, elastic way. Each minute stretched like an eternity. I shared with him small stories of my life, not the grand moments, but the details: how I loved to bake bread with my husband, how he had the worst sense of humor, but always made me laugh. How I had once lost myself in a garden of tulips just to remember that beauty existed. He listened, wide-eyed, silent, but occasionally nodding, letting the warmth of connection seep in where fear had lived. And yet, even in this fragile new beginning, I sensed the shadows lurking behind his eyes. There was more to his story than just loneliness. Something about him, the way he carried himself, the quiet desperation, hinted at secrets and burdens I could not yet grasp. I wrapped my arms around him tighter, offering what I could: protection, warmth, the promise that for tonight, at least, he was safe, he was seen, he was loved. The night deepened, and the cold grew sharper, but we remained there, together, to strangers in a cruel world who had chosen each other as family. As we huddled together trying to keep warm, I noticed the fear in his eyes was hiding a story far bigger than ours, a story that would change both our lives forever. The morning after our first night together, I awoke to the faint sound of him shifting beside me, rubbing his eyes with small, delicate hands. His face was streaked with dirt, but beneath that grime, there was a softness, a vulnerability I hadn't expected. I offered him the small warmth of my coat, still stiff from the night's cold, and he clutched it as if it were a lifeline. I ran away, he said quietly, voice breaking. I didn't need him to elaborate, but he went on anyway, his words tumbling out in a mix of fear and relief. My parents, they want to send me to study in London. Boarding school. Against my will. They don't understand, they don't care what I want. His shoulders shook as he sank back against the wall, hugging his knees. I'd rather be homeless than invisible. The rawness of his admission hit me like a physical blow. Invisible. That word echoed in my mind, reverberating off the hollow places I had carried for months. How familiar that sense of being overlooked felt, how similar to my own life since losing my husband, when even my daughter turned her back on me. I reached out slowly, resting a hand on his shoulder, careful not to startle him. "You're not invisible to me," I whispered. "Not tonight. And not ever while I'm here." We spent the day wandering, seeking refuge wherever we could. By mid-morning, we found a community shelter tucked behind a busy street, its exterior unassuming, but its doors open to anyone who needed help. Inside, the air was warm, though tinged with the scent of soap, disinfectant, and lingering fear. Families, single parents, and other lost souls filled the room with muted chatter, the quiet clinking of trays, and soft cries that came and went like the ebb and flow of some invisible tide. I tried to help him settle in, offering the small comfort of a blanket from the donation pile. He looked at me with wide, uncertain eyes, his voice barely a whisper. I don't want anyone to find me yet, please." I nodded, understanding more than he realized. Some secrets, some safety, must be earned before trust can take root. As the day unfolded, small moments revealed the careful planning behind his disappearance. His hair had been cut unevenly, strands sticking out in odd angles, and his clothes, once pristine and tailored, were deliberately muddied. He had even left his phone behind, a calculated decision to keep his security team from tracking him too quickly. I realized, with both shock and admiration, that this frightened child had already begun navigating the treacherous waters of survival with a resourcefulness far beyond his years. During that week, we carved out our own fragile routine amidst the shelter's chaos. Donated sandwiches and fruit became feasts when shared with laughter. He recounted stories about his life in the mansion, the tutors who recited math formulas instead of bedtime stories, the nannies who could soothe but never lingered, and the bodyguards who followed him everywhere yet never asked how he was feeling. I listened, amazed at how alone a child could be in a house full of people. I shared my own stories too, carefully sprinkling in moments of light, of love I had once known. I told him about my husband, how his laugh could fill a room, how we had baked bread together, and how the quiet garden had been our sanctuary. Slowly, we began to laugh at small things, the absurdity of a misfired donation dinner, the way he attempted to teach me a clumsy handstand, the way we both stumbled over mismatched words in our makeshift conversation. It was in those moments that I realized love could flourish even in hardship. The walls of loneliness I had built around my heart began to crumble, replaced by the fragile bloom of trust. Michael confided his deepest dream, a family that saw him not as a business asset or a public image, but as a child who deserved to be held, to be loved, to be noticed for simply being. I just want someone to know I exist for me," he admitted one afternoon, his small voice trembling. I reached out, brushing a dirty strand of hair from his face. "You are seen, Michael. And you will be, no matter what it takes." Each evening, we shared whispered thoughts, silent promises that whatever came, we would protect each other in this fleeting sanctuary. I watched him sleep, small chest rising and falling, and my heart ached for all he had been denied. His fragility, his courage, his quiet yearning for connection, it all mirrored pieces of my own longing, and yet together we created a warmth neither of us had known we could find. The shelter staff noticed us, occasionally offering extra blankets or food, their eyes kind but wary, as if they sensed the fragile bond forming between us. And in that bond, I began to feel a small glimmer of purpose again. I wasn't just a lost, discarded widow. I was a protector, a witness, a grandmother, however temporary it might seem. Then, on the 7th day, the world intruded into our fragile bubble. A small television flickered to life in the common room, and the screen flashed with images I would never forget, a well-dressed family standing in polished boardrooms, and beneath them, the words in bold, urgent letters, missing heir, Michael White, son of XP Tech founders. Still missing. $500,000 reward offered. Michael froze, his small hands gripping the edge of his chair. I felt the tremor run through his body, the same fear I had known walking the streets the night before. Other residents paused, murmuring, pointing, watching with curiosity and disbelief. My stomach knotted. This was far bigger than I could have imagined. I reached for him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "It's okay," I whispered, trying to infuse my voice with steadiness I didn't fully feel. "We'll figure this out. I promise I won't let anyone hurt you." His eyes met mine, wide and vulnerable, and in that moment, the bond we had begun to forge, the trust, the warmth, the shared understanding became a lifeline. But beneath that flicker of hope, I sensed the storm that was about to break, a storm far larger than our small, fragile world. As we sat together, Michael trembling against me, the weight of his identity began to sink in. He wasn't just a scared, lonely child. He was Michael White, heir to the XP Tech empire, and the world was now aware that he had vanished. My heart froze as Michael's face filled the flickering screen, framed in the harsh, clinical lighting of the news studio. The camera lingered on him for a moment, small and trembling, before cutting to a formal caption, "Missing heir, Michael White, son of XP Tech founders. Last seen near downtown, $500,000 reward offered." My stomach clenched, and the blood drained from my face. I felt the old, familiar ache of helplessness settle in my chest, but this time it wasn't mine alone. I felt it coiled in his, radiating in silent, palpable fear. The other shelter residents murmured around us, curious and uncertain, glancing toward Michael with a mix of awe and confusion. Their whispers scratched at the quiet we had built, small fragments of intrusion into the fragile cocoon we had formed. Michael's eyes widened, and I saw the panic ripple across his face in slow, heartbreaking waves. He pressed himself closer to me, clutching my arm, fingers digging in as if the act of holding me could anchor him to safety. "Julie, they're looking for me," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the television. His small body shivered, not just from the chill of the room, but from the sudden enormity of the world bearing down on him. I wrestled with disbelief. How could a family so powerful, with resources beyond imagination, allow a child to feel so invisible, so unloved? That he would flee their mansion and choose the uncertain streets over their grandeur? My mind kept replaying the fragments of his stories: tutors who taught him algebra instead of empathy, nannies who could administer a bath but never stay for a bedtime story, bodyguards who followed him everywhere but never asked if he was happy. And yet, even amidst the wealth and comfort, he had gone unseen. His choice, terrifying and bold, was the purest declaration that neglect can wound deeper than poverty or hardship ever could. But alongside disbelief, there was understanding of danger, I knew. As his makeshift grandmother, that returning him now would mean sinking him back into the cold, lonely world he had fled. The streets, harsh and unforgiving, had at least offered him recognition, a bond even if fragile with someone who truly saw him. The mansion, gilded and pristine, had only offered invisibility. The choice was clear: we could not return him without changing the narrative entirely. I took a deep breath, forcing steadiness into my trembling voice. "Michael," I whispered, brushing a strand of dirt-streaked hair from his forehead, "I'm going to stay by your side. But we need to do this right. We need to make them see what they've done to you." His eyes met mine, wide with fear and something else: hope, fragile but flickering. He clung to that hope like a lifeline, and I vowed silently that I would not let it go. For the next 3 days, we remained hidden. Every movement was cautious, every step calculated to avoid recognition, but we also tried to preserve normalcy in small, vital ways. I documented everything: his tears, the way his small shoulders slumped under invisible weight, his quiet confessions about feeling like a business asset rather than a son. His longing for a parent's presence, even just a smile that said, "You matter." I borrowed a phone from a sympathetic shelter volunteer, discreetly filming video testimonies. Michael, hesitant at first, began to share pieces of himself he had long kept locked away, and with every confession, our bond deepened. We created our own little world of joy amidst the chaos of the shelter. A tray of donated sandwiches became a banquet when we laughed over who had gotten the smallest slice. We traced imaginary maps across the floor, pretending the linoleum tiles were kingdoms we could rule. He taught me to fold paper airplanes perfectly, and we spent long afternoons launching them from the top of the stairwell, watching them glide like fragile wings of freedom. Every laugh, every shared secret, every stolen moment of peace built a fortress around our hearts, even as the outside world churned with threats and uncertainty. But beneath the laughter, I was preparing for war. The truth, carefully documented, was a weapon against the apathy and cold priorities of his family. I had no interest in money or influence. My goal was justice, recognition, and above all, the reclamation of a childhood stolen by neglect and obsession with wealth. The stories he shared, the small acts of rebellion he had orchestrated to hide from trackers, all became evidence, testaments to the desperation and brilliance of a child who simply wanted to be seen. At night, we whispered plans, imagining ways to make the world understand, ways to ensure he would never feel invisible again. He clung to me as if my presence alone could shield him from the storm he knew was inevitable. "Julie, do you think will they even listen?" he asked softly, voice cracking. I stroked his hair, trying to infuse certainty I didn't fully feel. "They will, Michael. We'll make sure they see you. Not just as an heir, not just as a name, but as you. And they won't be able to look away." Each day, I marveled at his courage, his resilience. A boy of 12, forced to navigate a world of adults and indifference, yet somehow finding trust, laughter, and love with someone who had herself been discarded. I felt protective in a way I had never imagined possible, a fierce, maternal instinct rising from the depths of my own grief and loss. I had nothing left to give, and yet, somehow, I gave everything: time, attention, warmth, love. And in return, he offered me trust, innocence, and glimpses of joy I had feared lost forever. Then, on the 10th day, as we quietly ate the small breakfast of donated oatmeal and stale bread, the door burst open. My heart leapt into my throat as a group of sharply dressed security men stormed the shelter, scanning the room with precise efficiency. Panic rippled through the residence. Michael froze, eyes wide, and I grabbed his small hand, holding it tightly as if sheer will could keep them at bay. Someone had recognized him, called the reward hotline, and the consequences of his identity, the truth I had hoped to shield, were crashing down upon us in waves. I drew a deep breath, heart pounding, and whispered into his ear, "Stay close, whatever happens, I'm not letting go." The air was thick with fear, the room buzzing with whispers. And I knew in that instant that our lives were about to change forever. When they came for him, it happened faster than my mind could process. The front door of the shelter swung open with a crash that made the walls tremble. Men in dark coats filled the doorway, the metallic glint of earpieces visible beneath their collars. They looked out of place among the chipped tables and weary faces, like hunters in a place meant for the hunted. And then one of them pointed. "There. That's him." Michael froze, and for a moment the whole room seemed to inhale at once. He looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes, his small hand clutching mine so tightly that I felt the tremor in his bones. "Julie," he whispered, his voice breaking on the edge of panic. I didn't think I just pulled him behind me. "You can't take him like this," I shouted, my voice trembling but fierce. "He's a child. He's scared." The nearest guard, a tall man with a shaved head, moved toward me, his expression impassive, trained. "Ma'am, step aside. We're here on family orders." Family. The word felt poisoned in my mouth. Family doesn't send an army to drag their child home. Michael's cries tore through the chaos. "Julie, please. Don't let them take me." His voice cracked in that way only a child's can, desperate, full of unspoken terror. He reached out, but one guard caught him by the arms, lifting him off his feet as though he weighed nothing. I lunged forward, but another man blocked my path, his hand firm against my shoulder. "Please." I screamed. "You don't understand what you're doing to him." The guard didn't flinch. "Ma'am, step away. This is a family matter." That word again, family. It sliced through me like glass. I thought of my own daughter, of the night she had thrown me out into the cold, of how the word family had become something that others wielded as an excuse for cruelty. I stood there, shaking, my breath clouding in the cold air of the open doorway, as Michael disappeared into the sleek black van waiting outside. The sound of the door slamming echoed through me, and then he was gone. For a long moment, I couldn't move. The shelter was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. My knees gave out, and I sank to the floor, my palms pressed against the rough tile. Every sound, every heartbeat, seemed to fade until there was only the empty ache of loss. It felt as if a piece of me had been ripped away. But grief soon gave way to something sharper resolve. I still had the videos. The truth. The proof of the loneliness and neglect that had driven Michael into the streets. They could silence me, ignore me, dismiss me, but they couldn't erase what I had seen. That night, under the dim light of a borrowed laptop, I began sending emails. I wrote to every journalist I could find, attaching the clips I'd recorded, Michael's trembling confessions, his stories about being treated like an investment rather than a son, his small laugh as we shared food and warmth. I begged them to listen. I begged them to see. Most didn't reply. The few who did were polite but dismissive, skeptical of a homeless old woman making wild claims about one of the wealthiest families in America. Days passed. Hope dimmed. Then, just as I began to wonder if the world had gone deaf, I received a message from a young reporter named Sarah Chen. Her email was simple: "I believe you. Can we meet?" When she arrived at the shelter, she stood out immediately, sharp eyes, quick movements, a notepad tucked beneath her arm. She was young, maybe 30, but there was an intensity in her that reminded me of what it feels like to still believe that truth matters. We sat at one of the cafeteria tables as I showed her everything. The footage, the transcripts, the desperate timeline I'd pieced together. She watched silently, her brow furrowing, her hand occasionally pressing against her mouth in disbelief. When the final video ended Michael's tearful plea that he would rather be homeless than invisible, she looked up at me. "This is explosive," she said softly. "But you need leverage. The whites will bury this story before it ever sees daylight." Her words hit me like cold rain. "Then what do we do?" I asked. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with focus. "We make it impossible for them to hide." Over the next few days, Sarah began digging. She had access to things I could only imagine: records, schedules, whispers from sources inside XB Tech. What she uncovered chilled me to my core. Board meetings had continued as usual the day Michael disappeared. His parents hadn't postponed a single one. Instead, they had prioritized an international acquisition deal, their focus shifting to public relations management rather than the actual search for their son. They had hired a team of crisis managers to control the narrative, ensuring that shareholders wouldn't panic. I listened in stunned silence as Sarah laid out the details. They didn't stop for him, she said, almost in disbelief. They didn't even pause. I stared at the screen, where a spreadsheet displayed the cold efficiency of corporate priorities rows of meetings, contracts, deals. My chest tightened. He's their child, I murmured. How can they look at all this and not see what it's cost him? Sarah's voice softened. Because they've forgotten what love looks like when it doesn't come with a profit margin. Her words stayed with me long after she left that night. I sat by the window of the shelter, staring out at the flickering city lights, and thought of Michael somewhere in that vast mansion, probably locked behind gates that felt more like walls. Did he know I was still fighting for him? Did he think I had given up? The thought that he might believe that broke me. 2 weeks later, just as the ache of waiting had started to turn into despair, one of the volunteers handed me an envelope. My name was written on it in looping script, and when I turned it over, I saw the embossed seal of XBTech's logo. Inside was a heavy cardstock invitation and elegant, gold-edged card announcing XBTech's annual charity gala. My heart pounded as I read it again and again, barely processing the words. Sarah had done it. Somehow she had used her press credentials to get us in. Beneath the printed invitation was a handwritten note, "Be ready. Every major outlet will be watching. Let's make them listen." I clutched the card to my chest, the edges biting into my fingers, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose rising like a quiet storm inside me. I wasn't just a discarded mother anymore, I was someone with truth on her side. I almost didn't recognize myself in the mirror. It wasn't just the transformation on the outside, the borrowed elegant black dress, the soft touch of makeup Sarah had applied, the way she'd brushed my hair so it framed my face with quiet grace. It was something deeper, something stirring within me. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Not as a burden, not as a relic of a life long gone, but as a woman with purpose. Sarah smiled from behind me, her reflection glowing with the excitement of a journalist chasing truth. "You look like royalty," she said softly, her voice carrying both admiration and resolve. "Now go show them what a real grandmother looks like." Those words lodged deep in my chest. A real grandmother. Maybe I had lost my own family long ago, but somehow, through this strange twist of fate, I had become one again through compassion, not blood. When we arrived at the XBTech charity gala, the air itself shimmered with wealth. The marble floor reflected the golden chandeliers above, and the guests moved like a sea of glittering masks, perfect smiles, hollow eyes. Waiters glided by with trays of champagne that sparkled under the light, and laughter filled the room like artificial perfume. I clutched my small purse tighter, my heart pounding. The place smelled of money and power, but beneath that there was something else. Emptiness. Sarah leaned in and whispered, "Remember, they won't see you coming. That's your advantage." Across the ballroom, I spotted the Mr. and Mrs. White. They were poised on the stage, standing shoulder to shoulder. Picture perfect in their designer attire, the photographers adored them. Their flashes painting halos around the couple's carefully curated image. Mrs. White's diamond necklace caught the light, dazzling the crowd, while her husband's arm rested firmly around her waist as if to signal unity. They looked untouchable. But I knew better now. The host's voice echoed through the hall, Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founders of XP Tech, James and Victoria White, who will announce a special initiative close to their hearts. Close to their hearts. The irony nearly made me choke. As the applause filled the room, Victoria stepped forward, her tone polished and warm. Tonight, she began, we are proud to introduce a new scholarship program dedicated to underprivileged youth across the country. The crowd erupted in admiration. Cameras clicked. Glasses clinked. The hypocrisy was unbearable. I could feel my pulse in my throat. This was the moment Sarah and I had prepared for. She caught my eye from across the room, her hand subtly signaling me it was time. Then the screens behind the stage flickered. At first, no one noticed. Then the image shifted from the gala's promotional reel to something else entirely. A trembling voice filled the speakers. Michael's voice. I just wanted my parents to notice me, he said. The words were faint but unmistakable. To choose me over their meetings, just once, a hush fell across the ballroom. The air grew heavy, almost sacred in its silence. The image on the screen showed Michael sitting on the thin cot at the shelter, his face streaked with tears, his eyes wide and searching. Every word struck like a hammer to glass, shattering the illusion his parents had built. Gasps rippled through the audience. Heads turned. The Whites stood frozen, their smiles collapsing. Who did this? James hissed under his breath, his jaw tightening. But the microphones caught it. I rose from my seat, my hands trembling yet firm. My voice, though quivering at first, found its strength in the truth. I'm the woman who became this boy's grandmother when his real family forgot how. All eyes were on me. 1,000 faces turned, their expressions ranging from disbelief to awe. I could feel the heat of the spotlights, the stares, the whispers building like a tide. For 10 days, I continued, my words breaking slightly. I watched him cry himself to sleep, terrified of returning to a house where he felt invisible. There was no stopping now. My heart was exposed, raw but unashamed. He cut his hair with trembling hands, dirtied his clothes, and ran away not because he was rebellious, but because he was desperate to be seen. To be loved. The audience murmured louder, uneasy now. A woman near the front dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. A man in a suit shook his head, whispering something to his wife. The Whites stood still, pale, their perfect posture cracking under the weight of the truth. While you held board meetings and press conferences, I said, my voice rising. Your child held himself together in a cold shelter with nothing but the hope that anyone might care enough to leave. Sten. Sarah was filming everything, her phone steady in her hand. The truth was out now. It could not be buried again. James took a step forward, his expression darkening. This is slander, he said through gritted teeth. Security. But before anyone could move, something changed in the air. The ballroom doors burst open with a loud, echoing crash. For a moment, no one breathed. Then I saw him, Michael. His hair was messy again, his cheeks flushed, his small chest heaving as he pushed past the startled guards. His eyes found mine instantly, wide with relief and fear and something pure love, Grandma. He cried. The word hit me like sunlight breaking through clouds. He ran across the polished floor, his shoes slipping, his arms outstretched. Cameras turned, capturing every second. I barely had time to open my arms before he threw himself into them, clinging to me as though the world might take me away again. His face buried into my dress, his tears soaking through the fabric. The entire room was silent except for his sobs. I could feel his small body trembling against mine, the sound of his pain echoing off marble and crystal. My hands found the back of his head, smoothing his hair, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart." I'm Mia. Behind us, Victoria's composure finally shattered. Michael, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Her hand lifted halfway before falling again, as though she didn't know how to reach him anymore. The cameras captured everything: the mother's frozen regret, the father's rage, the broken illusion of the perfect family. I held Michael tighter, shielding him with my body as if love itself could be armor. In that moment, I didn't care about the headlines or the consequences. I only cared that he was safe, that he had found his way back. But even as I held him, I saw something shift in the crowd: a movement, a whisper through the guards, a tall man in a dark suit. Speaking urgently into his earpiece, Sarah's eyes widened from across the room. She mouthed something to me, her face pale. "They're taking him again." And before I could react, the same men who had torn him from me once began to advance, weaving through the frozen guests, their hands ready, their orders clear. I clutched Michael's shoulders and looked down at him, his tear-filled eyes reflecting my own fear. "Run," I whispered. He blinked, confused. But run, Michael. Now. The crowd erupted again, half shouting, half gasping. The chandelier lights blurred as chaos began to unfold. And just as he turned to flee, just as I thought we might have one last chance, someone grabbed my arm from behind, pulling me back with brutal force. I gasped, spinning to see who it was. And then I froze. Because standing before me, calm and deliberate, was not a guard. It was Mrs. White. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes glistened with something raw, something unfamiliar. "We need to talk," she said quietly, and as the chaos surged around us, as Michael disappeared once more into the storm of bodies and flashing lights, I realized this night was far from over. The truth had cracked the glass, but what would break next was still to come. I'll never forget the sound of cameras clicking that night, like 1,000 tiny verdicts being delivered at once. The image of Michael running into my arms while his parents froze on stage spread across the internet like wildfire. By sunrise, our faces were everywhere. Headlines screamed about neglect and greed. Tech Air finds love in the streets. XP Tech empire shaken by family scandal. Every network, every feed, every corner of the digital world was dissecting our story. The irony wasn't lost on me. After all those years feeling invisible, the world was finally looking right at me. But I wasn't proud. I wasn't even angry anymore. I just felt this deep ache for the boy who had only wanted to be seen by the people who should have loved him first. Michael's parents vanished from public view, hiding behind lawyers and PR statements. The official response was polished, soulless, and predictable: a misunderstanding. The boy is safe. The family requests privacy. Yet nothing could erase the image of that small boy clinging to me, or the tremor in his voice when he whispered, "Please don't let them take me again." The next few days blurred into interviews and meetings. Sarah and I were careful. Every time I spoke publicly, I refused to humiliate the Whites. Instead, I focused on Michael's heart, on what he needed. "They had everything," I said during one televised interview, my voice steady. "Everything except what mattered most: time for their son." The host leaned forward, her tone gentle but probing. "Julie, what do you think drove Michael to run away?" I hesitated, feeling the sting behind my ribs. "Loneliness," I answered. "It's heavier than hunger. It eats you from the inside out. And no amount of money can fill that emptiness." That line spread faster than any headline. Viewers connected. Mothers wrote to me from all over the country, some angry at the Whites, others grateful that someone had finally said what they'd been feeling. Still, the backlash came quickly. The Whites' legal team began their smear campaign within days. Reporters received anonymous tips questioning my mental health, claiming I had manipulated Michael for attention or money. There were whispers that I'd been paid to create the scandal, that I'd preyed on a vulnerable child. One article even suggested that my late husband's medical debt had driven me to extortion. For a moment, I felt the weight of it all pressing on me, the shame, the disbelief, the fear that the world might see me as something ugly. But Sarah refused to let me drown. "Julie," she said, sliding her laptop toward me. "They can spin all they want. But we have truth, and truth lasts longer than PR." Her next investigative piece dismantled every accusation. Shelter volunteers testified that I'd taken nothing, that I'd protected Michael even when it put me at risk. A counselor from the shelter described seeing us together, how I'd comforted him when he woke from nightmares. Piece by piece, the lies collapsed. Meanwhile, inside the XP Tech empire, chaos was brewing. Shareholders demanded answers. The board of directors questioned whether the company could survive with such a scandal at its core. In leaked emails, executives expressed doubts about Murdoch and Mrs. White's moral fitness to lead. But I didn't celebrate their downfall. I couldn't, because while they were losing credibility, Michael was losing peace. Reporters camped outside his school. Helicopters hovered over his home. The boy who'd just begun to heal now found himself trapped again, only this time in a gilded cage of flashing lights and microphones. We talked every night on the phone. "I hate them for this," he muttered once, voice shaking. "No," I said softly. "Don't let hate grow inside you, Michael. It's just another kind of prison." He was quiet for a long time before whispering, "I wish I could live with you." Those words split me open. "Me too," I whispered back. "But we'll find a way to make it right." Weeks passed. Public opinion began to shift. People weren't just angry, they were demanding justice. Talk shows debated emotional neglect as abuse. Child advocacy organizations reached out. And through it all, I felt something awaken inside me, a sense of purpose I hadn't known I was capable of. For decades, I'd been the kind of woman who quietly accepted what life gave me. But now I was standing up to billionaires, lawyers, and headlines. Not for fame. Not for vengeance. For truth. I moved into a small apartment paid for by a victims advocacy group that had offered support after the story broke. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a worn couch, but it was mine. Every evening, I'd make tea, sit by the window, and think about the strange path that had led me there. I missed Michael desperately. The sound of his laugh, the way his eyes lit up when he discovered kindness still existed. I'd trade every bit of attention I'd received just to hear him call me grandma again. One morning, Sarah dropped by unannounced. She looked exhausted but radiant, the kind of glow that comes from purpose. "Julie," she said, setting her phone on the table. "You're not going to believe this. The state's attorney is opening an inquiry into the Whites. Neglect, coercion, even emotional abuse. You started something real." I didn't know whether to cry or laugh. "I didn't start it," I murmured. "Michael did. He just wanted to be loved." We spent hours talking about what might come next: advocacy work, awareness campaigns, maybe even a foundation in Michael's name. I felt hope again, fragile but alive. That night, as I was washing dishes, someone knocked on my door. It was a soft, almost hesitant sound. For a second, I thought maybe Sarah had returned. But when I opened it, the air in my chest turned cold. There she was, Emily. My daughter. She looked thinner, paler than I remembered. Designer purse hanging from one wrist, fake concern plastered across her face. "Mom," she began, her tone rehearsed. "I saw you on TV. I wanted to check on you." I stood there, gripping the edge of the door, searching her eyes for something real. All I found was calculation, that same glimmer of opportunism I'd once mistaken for ambition. "You didn't seem so worried when you threw me out," I said quietly. Her lips trembled, but not from guilt. "Things were complicated then. You have to understand, I have bills, a mortgage," I laughed bitterly. "You asked your own mother for rent, Emily. And now that I'm associated with one of the richest families in America, you suddenly remember I exist." Her eyes darted to the camera crew stationed down the street, the reporters who still followed my story. "Mom, please," she whispered, lowering her voice. "You can't talk like that here. People are watching." "Oh, I know they are," I said, stepping closer, my voice trembling but strong. "For the first time, Emily, people are actually watching. And maybe now they'll see who we really are." Her mask cracked for just a second, enough for me to glimpse the jealousy, the panic, the greed underneath. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't over. Because behind that polished apology was a new threat, one far more personal than any lawsuit or scandal. I felt it deep in my bones. The war for justice wasn't finished. It had just found its way back to my doorstep. When Emily stepped into my apartment that evening, her perfume sweet, expensive, suffocating filled the small space like smoke. She smiled too wide, her voice trembling in that careful, performative way that always used to fool people. "Mom, I've been so worried about you," she exclaimed, brushing imaginary tears from her dry cheeks as she set her purse on my kitchen counter without asking. I watched her carefully, the same way a person studies a flame, beautiful, but dangerous if you lean too close. "You've been watching the news, haven't you?" I asked softly. Her eyes flickered, guilt mixing with curiosity. "Of course I have. I saw you on TV with that poor boy, what's his name again, Michael." She paused for effect, pretending to search her memory. "Mom, you were incredible. So brave." Her words sounded hollow, but I let her keep talking. "People like Emily often reveal themselves if you stay quiet long enough." She stepped closer, lowering her voice as if we were co-conspirators. "Listen, I know things were tense between us before. I shouldn't have said those things. I was stressed, John's job, the bills, everything. But that's the past. You can come home now. No rent, I promise." I smiled faintly, more sad than angry. "You threw me out into the cold, Emily," I said, my tone calm but cutting. "Do you think an apology erases that?" Her eyes hardened for a fraction of a second before softening again. "Mom, please. Don't be dramatic. We both said things we didn't mean. I just want us to be close again." But what she wanted wasn't closeness, it was proximity. Proximity to wealth, to attention, to power. I could see the calculation in her gaze as she subtly scanned my modest apartment, noticing the letters from advocacy groups, the flowers Michael's lawyer had sent, the news clippings pinned to my wall. Then came the real reason for her visit. "Actually," she said, sitting down and crossing her legs, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper, "I was thinking maybe I could help you with Michael. You've done such an amazing job with him, but you know how these wealthy families can be. They'll need someone polished, professional, someone like me to help manage the situation." She leaned in, smiling sweetly. "I could be like his aunt figure. We could both be part of his life." I almost laughed. "An aunt figure," I repeated, tasting the irony. She nodded eagerly. "Yes. I mean, imagine what good we could do together. Think about it, Mom, we could make sure Michael's story inspires people everywhere. And you'd never have to worry about money again." There it was, the truth slipping through her polished tone like a crack in glass. I didn't confront her directly. Instead, I smiled faintly and poured her a cup of tea. "That's very kind of you, Emily," I said. "We'll see where things go." Over the following weeks, I chose not to push her away. Instead, I decided to hold up a mirror. I became almost gracious, publicly forgiving, warm, even inviting. "Family deserves second chances," I said in interviews, always glancing at her when I did. The public adored it, the mother and daughter mending their bond after tragedy. But beneath that gentle facade, I was planting seeds. I spoke often about integrity, about how true character is revealed when life takes everything from you. "My daughter taught me something precious," I said once during a televised panel. "You only know who someone really is when you have nothing left to offer them." Emily smiled. Beside me, not realizing the blade hidden in the words, she mistook my composure for surrender. She started coming with me to meetings about advocacy work, sitting beside me during interviews, posing for pictures with Michael when we visited him under supervision. She'd place a hand on my shoulder and beam for the cameras, perfectly styled. Her every gesture rehearsed. Social media loved her. #StrongWomen, her followers wrote beneath. Staged photos of us holding hands. #FamilyFirst. I watched in silence as she built her own narrative. Emily, the dutiful daughter who had supported her mother through scandal. She started giving interviews of her own, talking about family values, second chances, and standing by loved ones no matter what. It would have been almost admirable if it weren't so manipulative. One afternoon, Sarah and I met at a cafe tucked away from the press. She leaned across the table, lowering her voice. "You're letting her get close on purpose, aren't you?" I nodded. "People don't change easily, Sarah, but sometimes you have to let them believe they've won so they'll reveal just how little they've learned." Sarah smiled faintly, understanding. "You're planning something, not planning," I said. Stirring my tea, preparing. There's a difference, still, even as I plotted quietly. A part of me ached. I looked at Emily sometimes and saw the little girl she used to be, the one who'd run to me crying after her first heartbreak. The one who used to fall asleep with her head on my lap while I brushed her hair. I wondered where that girl had gone, or if she had ever really been there at all. But then I'd remember that night she'd thrown me out, her cold voice cutting through the dark. "If you don't have money, go sleep with the dogs." And the softness inside me would harden again. By the end of the month, Emily was everywhere. She'd even started being invited to events without me. The media loved her polished charm, her redemption arc. I stayed patient. There are some truths that can't be forced, they have to reveal themselves in front of everyone at exactly the right moment. One evening, Sarah showed up at my apartment again, her face flushed with excitement. "Julie," she said, "we've got it." The White family finally agreed to a live television interview exclusive. They want to talk about their path forward, how they're rebuilding after everything. I nodded, feeling my stomach tighten. "And Michael. He'll be there," she said softly. "His parents too." But that's not all. Sarah hesitated, glancing down at her phone. "Your daughter convinced the producers to include her. She'll be introduced as your essential support system. Apparently, she told them she's been your rock through all of this." For a second, I just stared at her. My pulse pounded in my ears, not from anger, but from something sharp, a betrayal mixed with disbelief. Of course she had. Of course Emily would find a way to twist the story, to step into the spotlight she never earned. Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. "What are you going to do?" I looked out the window, watching the reflection of city lights blur in the glass. Somewhere in that glow, I could almost see my younger self, the quiet, obedient woman who once believed love meant forgiveness at any cost. "I'm going to let her talk," I said finally, my voice steady. And when she does, the world will see her truth, not the one she invented, but the one she's spent her whole life hiding. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, low and heavy, as if the sky itself knew something was coming. The interview was set for next week. Live. No edits. No second chances, and I could feel it something shifting beneath the surface, a reckoning waiting to unfold. The lights on set burned hot against my skin, but the cold silence that followed my words was even sharper. You could hear the cameras adjusting, the breath of a stunned audience filling the void left by my confession. Emily's painted smile faltered, her body froze in that strange tension between shame and fury, like a person caught naked in a room full of mirrors. For a brief second, I almost pitied her. Almost. Because I knew that kind of exposure, the unbearable moment when the truth tears through the lies you've wrapped yourself in, can either cleanse you or destroy you. And yet, I also knew she'd brought it on herself. Every sweet word, every carefully staged photo, every false tear, it had been a performance. And tonight, the curtain had finally dropped. The host, clearly unprepared for such raw emotion, stammered something about taking a short break, but the producers waved him off. The world was watching. And no one wanted to blink. Emily's voice cracked first. "Mom, you're making a scene. You don't know how this looks." Her tone wavered between pleading and control, the way it used to when she was a little girl caught lying, but still trying to rewrite the story in her favor. I turned to her fully. "How it looks," I whispered. "Emily, this is how truth looks. Messy. Uncomfortable. Real." Her eyes darted toward the cameras, desperate. "You're ruining everything." "No," I interrupted softly, the kind of softness that cuts deeper than anger. "You did that when you forgot that love isn't something you trade for appearances or applause." The footage on the big screen played again, her fake concern. The hunger in her eyes when she mentioned the whites. The audience gasped, somewhere in the studio. I heard someone sniffle. Maybe it was one of the camera crew. Maybe it was one of the producers, maybe it was the sound of something human breaking through the polished glass of the show. And then came the sound that shattered the entire performance, the sound of a woman crying honestly for the first time. Mrs. White rose from her chair, her composure gone, mascara streaking down her flawless face. Her hand trembled as she pointed toward Emily. "She's right," she whispered, voice trembling. "That's what we've been. That's exactly who we are." Her husband looked at her, startled. But she kept speaking, her voice trembling but fierce. "We dressed up our neglect in charity. We hid behind donations and foundations, pretending to care about the world while our own son disappeared into it." She looked directly at me, tears blurring her vision. "You reminded us what love actually looks like because you had nothing and still gave him everything." I wanted to hate her, to remind her of the nights Michael cried, the trembling hands, the fear that haunted him even in sleep. But all I saw in her eyes now was the reflection of a woman who had finally seen her own emptiness. White stepped forward, his voice heavy with something that sounded a lot like remorse. "We built an empire on innovation and progress," he said, "but we forgot to build a home. We can't change the past, but we can start with honesty. You don't have to forgive us, Julie, but we need to earn the right to be parents again." Something inside me softened. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a recognition that sometimes redemption begins in ruins. The host, seizing the moment, turned to me. "Julie, you've witnessed more transformation in a few weeks than most people see in a lifetime. What do you think happens next?" I opened my mouth, but before I could answer, I saw movement behind the cameras. A flash of blonde hair, a small frame darting toward the stagey Michael. His little shoes slapped against the glossy floor, the sound echoing through the studio. His therapist reached out, calling his name, but he didn't stop. When he reached me, he hesitated not out of fear, but confusion. His eyes flicked between me and his parents. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a motion that broke every heart in that room, he turned and ran not to me but to them. Mrs. White gasped as he threw his arms around her waist, pressing his face into her dress. Ma. White immediately knelt beside them, his arms trembling as he wrapped them both around his son. No cameras mattered in that moment. No audience. No wealth. Just a boy and his parents, finally seeing each other as human beings instead of roles to perform. Tears blurred my vision. I didn't feel abandoned, I felt relieved. Because for the first time, Michael wasn't looking for me to fill the void his parents left. He was finally letting them do the work themselves. Emily stood frozen beside me, her hands twitching, her face pale. Her perfect posture wilted as she realized the applause wasn't for her, the story wasn't hers to steal. Sarah, from behind the curtain, met my gaze. Her eyes glistened. She mouthed, "You did it." But I wasn't so sure, because even as I watched that family begin to heal, a shadow of unease crept over me. The audience's cheers faded into a blur. Something about Emily's expression, a flicker of bitterness, of wounded pride, made the hairs on my neck stand on end. She leaned closer, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "You think you've won," she whispered. "But you don't know everything, Mom." Before I could respond, she turned to the cameras, smiling again to wide, to bright. The lights glinted in her eyes like something dangerous, and just as the host began thanking everyone for this extraordinary, heartfelt conversation, a producer rushed onto the stage. Pale as paper, whispering something into Sarah's ear, Sarah's face drained of colour, she looked at me, then at Emily. The air grew thick. Something was coming, and whatever it wasn't over. Yet. The months following the broadcast felt surreal, almost dreamlike. The tension that had gripped every nerve of my body began to loosen, replaced by the steady hum of ordinary life, laughter spilling from the kitchen, the scent of Michael's favourite dinner simmering on the stove, and the quiet satisfaction of watching two people try, earnestly, to rebuild a fractured bond with their son. Change wasn't immediate, and the Whites had far to go, but the steps they took were deliberate, visible, tangible. Mr. White delegated more responsibilities at the company, stepping away from the constant swirl of meetings and acquisitions, a man learning, belatedly, how to simply be present. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but each day he remembered Michael's birthday, asked about his day at school, or lingered a moment longer at bedtime. Those small, intentional pauses of attention, of love, carried more weight than any business deal ever could. Mrs. White, whose public image had always seemed untouchable, declined invitations that once meant the world to her, glamorous speaking tours and high-profile galas to sit at the kitchen table helping Mikey L with homework or listening to him read aloud, sometimes correcting his pronunciation with a gentle smile instead of a reprimand. She brought warmth to spaces that had been cold for far too long, her voice softening as she learned to truly hear the boy she had once neglected. And then there was Michael, who thrived not because he finally had the trappings of wealth restored, but because he felt seen and safe. I watched him playfully chase our small terrier across the living room, a sound I would have thought impossible to hear coming from the boy who had once trembled in the alley under a thin coat. He laughed without fear now, without the hesitation that comes from expecting disappointment at every turn. Each smile was a testament to resilience, to the power of love chosen freely. The Whites invited me to share in every moment. I wasn't just an observer, a hired hand, or a token figure. I was the grandmother Michael had chosen, the one who had held him when the world abandoned him. I accepted the role fully, feeling a sense of belonging I hadn't known in decades. Each hug, each whispered "I love you," Grandma Julie, cemented my place in this unconventional but genuine family. It wasn't about blood at least, not yet. It was about being present when presence mattered most. Emily, meanwhile, continued to attempt her own interventions. Calls, letters, unannounced visits to the estate all met with firm but polite refusals by security. I could feel her resentment, the bitter tang of entitlement that never truly left her. One afternoon, our paths finally crossed in the most mundane of places, a grocery store. She cornered me in the produce aisle, her expression a mixture of fury and desperation. "You turned everyone against me," she hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "I'm your daughter." I looked at her calmly, taking a deep breath, letting the warm sunlight spill across the shelves between us. "You stopped being my daughter the moment you valued money over my humanity," I said softly, deliberately. "I forgive you, Emily, because carrying hate would poison me. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. You will need to find your own path to becoming a better person without profiting from my pain." Her face contorted in disbelief and frustration, her hands balling into fists, and then she stormed away, leaving a strange emptiness that was both bitter and peaceful. For the first time in years, I felt free not just from her cruelty, but from the weight of carrying anger that had no purpose but to hurt me. Life moved forward in its quiet, beautiful way. Michael's school performances were no longer solitary. Both of his parents cheered louder than anyone. We shared ordinary meals, ordinary moments, and the extraordinary joy of being seen and heard. Laughter filled the hallways of the White Estate, a sound that had once seemed impossible, a music I never thought I'd hear again. Yet even amidst this newfound harmony, there remained a small, delicate thread of mystery, one that quietly tugged at the edges of our story. While sorting through old photographs and documents to decorate Michael's bedroom, Mrs. White stumbled upon a faded photograph tucked between the pages of a worn album. She held it up, her brow furrowed as she studied the delicate details of the past. "Julie," she whispered, her voice trembling like fine glass, "did your mother-in-law's maiden name happen to be White?" My blood ran cold as I took the photograph from her hands, squinting at the features that seemed hauntingly familiar: the high cheekbones, the shape of the eyes, the subtle curve of a smile that mirrored my own husband's. Memories flooded back, dormant for decades: the quiet gestures, the family gatherings, the small acknowledgements of lineage that had always seemed inconsequential. I couldn't breathe for a moment, my chest tightening as the realization took hold. Could it be possible that the connection between my late husband and the White family was more than coincidence? My hands shook, and I felt a tremor run through my entire body. The history of my family, the love and loss, the struggle and survival, seemed to hinge on this single, fragile photograph. Mrs. White's eyes searched mine, brimming with the same questions. "Julie, this changes everything, doesn't it?" I swallowed hard, the weight of possibility pressing on me like a storm cloud. I had always believed that blood didn't make a family, that love and choice were what bound us together. But this revelation hinted at something deeper, something I had never anticipated. Weeks passed slowly, each day marked by a strange tension, a quiet waiting for answers that seemed too incredible to be real. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a sealed envelope arrived in the mail, addressed in an elegant hand. My hands trembled as I accepted it, and Mr. White, sensing the gravity, took it with a mix of awe and trepidation. He broke the seal, and as he unfolded the contents, his hand shook visibly. The room was silent, the world seeming to pause for the revelation within that small, innocuous piece of paper. We were distant relatives. My late husband had been a third cousin to the White family, which meant that Michael and I shared actual blood, however thin, however distant. The knowledge sent a shiver through me, a strange blend of disbelief and profound wonder. I looked at Michael, who was playing quietly with a model spaceship in the corner. He looked up, his bright eyes catching the sunlight. The bond we had forged, born from choice and love in the harshest of circumstances, now carried a hidden, almost poetic symmetry. It didn't change the moments we had shared, the nights we had endured together, the tears we had wiped away, or the laughter that had followed. But it added a layer of destiny, a faint whisper of fate woven into the story of our lives. And yet, even as I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my hands, I knew this was only the beginning of understanding what it truly meant. The past had always shaped the present, but the future, our future, was still unwritten. I felt the weight of legacy, of history, of bloodlines intertwined with love, standing quietly in the room. The moment held a profound stillness, like the pause before the first note of a symphony, a silence heavy with promise and revelation. What this connection truly meant, and how it might ripple through our lives, was a question we would soon face, but the answer had the power to reshape everything we thought we knew about family, love, and destiny. The revelation of the genetic connection added an almost poetic layer to our story, but in truth, it changed nothing about what truly mattered. I held Michael close that night as we read our bedtime stories, his small hands clutching the edges of the book, eyes wide with imagination and trust. Blood didn't bring us together, I whispered softly, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. Love did. And that's far more powerful than any DNA could ever be. He snuggled closer into the warmth of the blanket and the warmth of my arms. His voice, hesitant but earnest, asked, "Does this mean you were always meant to be my grandma?" I smiled, feeling the deep swell of emotion behind that question. "No, sweetheart," I said. "It means I chose to be your grandma when you needed one. That choice, that love is what makes it real." As he drifted toward sleep, murmuring something about dragons and castles, I lingered in the quiet of the room, reflecting on the winding, uneven path that had brought me here. I thought of the crushing betrayal on Emily's doorstep. The nights when loneliness felt like a physical weight pressing on my chest. And the moments when I wondered if the world had forgotten me. And yet, somehow, through heartbreak and pain, I had arrived at this small sanctuary of warmth, laughter, and the kind of belonging I had thought I'd never know again. I realized, more deeply than ever, that true wealth had nothing to do with money, power, or possessions. True wealth was measured in the laughter of a child, in the comfort of shared silences, in the courage to be vulnerable and yet still find connection. The Whites had transformed our lives in ways that went far beyond generosity. With Julie's Kitchen, they created more than just a foundation, they created hope. Families who had once gone hungry, children who had been overlooked, found resources, guidance, and care. And I, having endured loss and rediscovered purpose, became its director. Each day brought new challenges, but every success, no matter how small, felt like a brick in the construction of something lasting, something meaningful. Emily, in her own quiet way, began to find a path back. She volunteered through the foundation, unseen and uncelebrated, offering her time without expectation. The wounds between us had not disappeared, but I glimpsed the first sparks of humility, the faintest recognition that life had taught her lessons she had once resisted. Perhaps redemption was possible for anyone willing to do the work of confronting themselves, acknowledging mistakes, and embracing the courage to try again. Michael graduated from middle school with a mixture of pride and nerves. His parents sat in the front row, cheering louder than anyone else, their smiles wide and eyes glistening with emotion. That evening, we celebrated with a home-made cake in our kitchen, nothing elaborate, just the smell of sugar and chocolate mingling with the warm, familiar scent of home. We laughed, reminisced about small victories and misadventures, and for a few hours, the world outside our walls seemed irrelevant. When I tucked Michael into bed that night, he whispered in a voice barely above a breath, "Grandma Julie, I'm scared sometimes that I'll wake up and this will all be a dream. That you'll be gone." I pressed my lips to his forehead, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath my hand. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "This is real. We're real. And love like ours, it doesn't disappear, no matter what happens outside these walls." He closed his eyes, a sleep-laden smile tugging at his lips. "Can we stay this happy forever?" I looked around his room, the photos on the walls chronicling adventures big and small, the drawings his parents had made that he had insisted on framing, the stuffed dog I had won him at a fair, now sitting guard beside his pillow, and I realized that happiness was not some far-off destination. It was built in tiny moments, in the deliberate choices to show up, to forgive, to care, and to love despite fear and uncertainty. "Forever is made of moments like this one," I whispered. "And we'll keep choosing them together every single day." Through the window, the city lights twinkled, the streets I had once wandered alone and hopeless now shimmering with possibility and promise. The world outside was unchanged, yet I perceived it differently. I understood at last that true home is not built from bloodlines or wealth, it is constructed from patience, sacrifice, forgiveness, and the unflinching courage to love even when the world has whispered that you are not worthy. I lingered in the doorway a moment longer, watching Michael's breathing slow, watching the rise and fall of his chest as sleep claimed him. I felt a quiet gratitude swell in me, gratitude for the path that had been so painful and yet so illuminating, for the people who had chosen to love me when I had lost my own way, and for the fragile, miraculous gift of belonging. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, its uncertainties, its unpredictable turns. But tonight, we had found what both of us had been searching for, a place where we belonged, a family that chose us back, a home stitched together with love, resilience, and hope. Home at last. And if you feel touched by this journey, if you believe in the power of chosen family and the small moments that build true happiness, I invite you to join us on this path. Subscribe to the channel, and let's discover together how love can transform even the most unexpected lives.